Hello everybody, it's Phil Rodenbeck from Visitor Watch Co. And today I'm excited to do a design review of the newest member of the Calligraph family, the Duneshore Shallows. So first let's go over what is the same about the Duneshore Shallows with respect to the other members of the Calligraph family, which are of course the original Duneshore and the Linden. And so all members of the Calligraph family have these pen nib inspired hands, which is present on the Duneshore Shallows again. Of course, the minute hand has sort of evolved here to be more of a diver style, or functional as a very large indicator for elapsed timing. Also, carried through the Calligraph family is this semi-gloss finish on the dial, which is supposed to remind you of wet ink. This is kind of the look that we're going for here. And of course that comes through a little easier on that idea translates a little bit better, sure, on black dials and blue dials, since those are the traditional ink colors. But you have the pen hands, the inky dial, and then you have these ink drop style hour markers, and these are all applied polished steel. And then a sandwich dial. All of these minute marks, if you look, actually show through to a lower dial that is loom printed. So that's a very subtle touch, which adds some depth to this dial. That is, just kind of a nice little hidden feature. But that's true on all of the Calligraph family dials. All have that minute marks, which are actually perforations. And they all have a black crosshair. The black crosshair is a family trait, so to speak, that carries through every dial color. So on white it's black, on green it's black, and then on black it is black. So that depending on the dial color you choose, that crosshair is more prominent or more of a ghost print. And the same is true then of the dial signature, which is also done in loom. And so obviously on this black dial here, it is high contrast, and then on a white dial it is more of a ghost signature. And the loom on the Shallows is C3 Superluminova instead of BGW9 on the previous Calligraph members. So you still have that loom dial signature, but it is more of a greenish hue as opposed to pure white. So those are sort of the traits of the Calligraph family that have come over to the Shallows. So then let's talk about the differences, sort of the evolution that occurred to go from this watch, the original Duneshore, to its diver variant. The main feature, which has carried over here, is this sand dunes inspired mid case. This mid case with all these sweeping, curving planes of steel, and that is really, despite the visual similarities between these two watches, this is like the only real part that carried over between the two. Every other component, I think, is totally new for this watch. Of course, this part isn't even completely the same, because the finishing has been updated to brushed instead of polished. So the original Duneshore has 100 meters of water resistance, which honestly is probably fine for a casual diver. You're not going to be diving too deep than that. Most of us aren't, those who dive. But we wanted to beef that number up, so it doubled to 200 meters. And in order to do that, we had to make a couple changes, obviously. So this central circular case has actually been thickened up, the radius increased by 1 millimeter. So that means the dial opening consequently got smaller. And as a result, all of these hands had to be made new in order to keep all the proportions correct. So this hour hand, even though it looks more or less identical to this hour hand, is actually a totally new part because it has to be a millimeter shorter. And the change to the minute hand is pretty obvious. This seconds hand is a little bit shorter to fit the dial, and it has gained this little loom circle on it. Also, and so in addition to increasing the thickness of that central case, the crown got beefed up and got a new gasket added in there. And then the case back, which was a curved display back on the original Duneshore, we kept the curvature. However, we chose to make the back solid in order to increase water resistance, and now we have this really cool deep embossed sea lion design. So still a curved back, still super comfortable, and you're still treated to this really cool display, just not a view of the movement. Obviously then another large change, perhaps the most obvious change, was the addition of a rotating bezel. So this is a 120 click steel bezel, which mounts in another reason. That was another reason to thicken up this central case. In addition to the water resistance, you need to house the spring for the bezel. The Duneshore Shallows then loses the date function. Since this is more of a sport watch, it felt appropriate to drop the date, which the previous members of the Calligraph family have had a date complication. And so as a result, then this watch uses the Miyota 9039, the dateless version, as opposed to this watch, which uses the 9015. The loom then was changed from BGW9 on the Duneshore to C3 Superluminova, which is a little brighter, a little sportier for the Shallows. The finishing has been updated, obviously, to mostly brushed, aside from a few polished elements, which I'll go into later. But now we have this brushed casework as opposed to the all polished. So then the other change that happened was to the buckle. Here we have the original Duneshore buckle, and then here is the updated Shallows buckle, which looks almost the same, except we have added this recessed section on the backside, which just lets the strap, particularly this new rubber strap, sit a little bit better, sit a little flatter. So those of you who have been following the brand for a long time may remember this watch, which we showed a handful of years ago, which was the original Duneshore Shallows prototype. And then this is the updated one. So the changes between these two, the main issue that we had with this iteration was the bezel legibility. So in this version, it was full loomed markings into the steel, which looks really cool in the dark, but the daytime legibility kind of suffered. So decided to make a change and just make the bezel way cooler, in my opinion. So now some of these elements are black paint, and then in the first 20 minutes you have these 4-minute intervals that are loomed, and then you have these 3 inset indices that are polished steel and then filled with loom. These indices, they're a small touch to the bezel, but they're one of my favorite features, my favorite details on the watch, actually. The other main change between this watch and this watch is that once the bezel was updated to include these polished inset indices, it seemed a little strange to have that be the only polished element of the case. And so we decided to change the finishing on the central circular case to polished, where it used to be brushed on the original version. And this polishing, I think, really it livens the already lively design up a bit more. And also, when you have the polished steel Duneshore bracelet on this watch, this helps that visual connection between the two just flow a little bit better than having this polished element run into a fully brushed element. This just looks a little more homogeneous. All right, so having covered what is the same between this watch and its other Calligraph family members, and then what's different between it and the Duneshore and the first prototype, I'd like to just go sort of top to bottom and discuss all of the design features and sort of the thinking behind each element. So in a lot of ways, the bezel is kind of the star of the show here. And I knew that I wanted to do when I was going to turn the Duneshore into a dive watch, that I wanted to do a steel bezel because that's just what I like. I really love steel bezel watches. However, I have always been a fan of that double bubble effect that is on, I guess the 50 Fathoms is probably the most notable example, but I think there's other ceramic bezel or sapphire bezel watches that have that double bubble effect, sort of that the radius of the bezel meeting that initial radius of the crystal. And I thought it'd be really cool to combine both of those ideas and doing a double bubble with a steel bezel. You have this conical element that starts, that kind of juts the bezel out from the case, and then you have a flat section where the teeth are, and then you have the domed steel that then curves over and meets the radius, that initial radius of the crystal. So really cool, unique shape, and just gives it a really unique vibe on wrist, because obviously that curved section reflects light, handles light differently than just a flat or just an angled steel bezel would. So the first 20 minutes of your elapsed timing scale are totally marked out with these 4-minute intervals in loom, and then the numbers in black paint. So then you have the 5-minute intervals after that, which are again cut into the steel there on an arc, and then filled paint with black paint. And the goal here is really to give you both daytime legibility and nighttime or dark environment legibility. And I think this bezel does that. Hopefully you think the same. I'll put some loom shots in, obviously, so you can judge the luminous quality of it. All right, so markings in steel, that's all been done before. The really cool element is these polished steel inset indices at the 30, 45, and 0 or 60 positions on the bezel. So inset indices are certainly not a brand new innovation. However, most of the time they're just like little cylinders that are inset into the bezel, and so they just have a singular flat plane on the top, and so from a manufacturing standpoint, it's certainly isn't cheap. It's less expensive to do a one-piece bezel, obviously, but it's not a crazy increase in cost. These markers are a little bit more complex because the indice surface actually ends up flush to the bezel surface. So rather than only having, a flat one dimension to worry about, you have this curvature that you have to match. And then on the 0 mark, it is raised 0.5 millimeter, but still curved, still echoing that radius, just raised up 0.5 millimeter there, so that you catch that polished edge, and at a glance it's easier to orient yourself with your elapsed timing that you made. So those are pretty cool, and I know people, obviously people always question where the price in a watch comes from. And so this is one of those design elements that is where some of your cost of entry goes. This bezel is 120 click and radially or circularly brushed. And so those polished elements really help to stand out against the circular brushing. Also, the shape of these indices, these inset indices, comes from the our door knocker logo. That the door knocker is actually sort of pointed at the tip, and so that same shape is used here for the indice idea. Coming out to the edge of the bezel, you'll see that there's this little flat section before you get to the grip. Having that flat surface run around the periphery of the bezel, light hits that differently, and it just helps to frame in that element. So it's just that little thought as to why you would do that, as opposed to just continue like a line tangent to that arc. The last thing that I want to say about the bezel is that it's super easy to grip. And again, that comes down to the design. So you have this sort of conical element where it mates to the central case, so that the bezel juts out and creates some space. And then the sand dunes mid case here, just by merit of having these big sweeping sections, you end up with all this empty space here, which happens to just be perfect for your fingers to grab this bezel. And there's enough room for you to have gloves on and still very easily be able to get a good grip on this bezel. So continuing on to the crystal then, pretty standard affair. Obviously you have this filleted edge to create that double bubble effect, and then there's just AR coating on the underside. So the dial design really begins with the handset, which is inspired by fountain pen nibs, which is something which is true on the entire Calligraph family of watches. So if you look, this is probably the easiest to understand looking at the hour hand here, and you can see how after this circular loom plot, you have this feature that looks like tines coming out to a smaller little loomed circle and a split in between. And that is supposed to be quite reminiscent of a fountain pen nib, where you have the split between the tines and then this sort of blob of tipping material at the end. And so yeah, that serves as the inspiration for these shapes that you see on the hour hand and the minute hand. So having hands inspired by pen nibs then kind of informs other decisions about what the dial is going to look like. So you have this semi-gloss finish on the dial, which is meant to be remind you of wet ink. You have these crosshairs, which are almost like, drawn lines with a pen. You have these teardrop or ink drop hour markers. These minute marks are actually perforations that show down to a lower dial printed in loom. So this is actually a sandwich dial. It's 2 dials pressed together simply to get this depth effect on the minute holes. Moving on to the second hand of the Duneshore Shallows, the main difference here between this and the original model is the addition of this little loom circle on the second hand, and that circle is actually the same radius as the very tip here of this ink drop marker. So as you see just there, as this passes the tip of that marker, that those two meet up and are actually the same size. So that's kind of cool. And of course, that is having some amount of loom on your seconds hand is standard for a dive watch, so that you can, if you were diving with the watch, you could be sure to know that it was running in a low light situation. So moving on to from the dial and the bezel to the case. First up, we have this polished central circular case, and this element sometimes, by merit of being polished, will kind of disappear in darker lighting environments especially, but it almost will give sort of this floating effect to the bezel at times, which I think is really neat. This polished central case also helps to tie in with the polished Duneshore bracelet a little bit better than just having an all brushed finish. This sand dunes inspired mid case is now brushed instead of polished. On the sides here, on the vertical sides, you have vertical brushing. And then on the angled sides, you have brushing that aligns with the long dimension of that plane. So it goes this way here and kind of goes in a gentle arc on the sort of the top and bottom planes. These lugs are, one of my favorite features of the Duneshore mid-case design. They sort of drape and at the same time twist away from the rest of the mid-case, from sort of the cushion portion. Looking down, there's an intentional break to keep this line intact towards the edge, which helps to keep the impression of a cushion case sort of alive when you look at this watch face down. Whereas if the start of this lug surface was pulled up and flush with this surface on the mid case, you would lose that a little bit. It would have less of that cushioniness to it, and so the lug surface here drapes down and then also drapes away from the mid case to preserve that line, and then also twists down here to come to this rolled and pierced tip where the strap then attaches. The same is true on the back side, where that cushion line is preserved by recessing this slightly. And the crown, compared to the original Duneshore, has been beefed up. It's a little bit thicker, extra gasket in there. Still unsigned, like on the original Duneshore, which is an intentional design decision, so that there's no little focus point that's breaking up all these interesting planes of metal. If you had some little scribbling right here, your eye would really be drawn to that, and it would sort of break up the illusion when this is on your wrist sometimes that you're just wearing like a little sculpture on your wrist rather than a watch. Almost forgetting that it's a watch for a moment, but purely a design piece. So moving on to the case back then, where the mid case carries around to the back, you have the same brush finishing where the brushing is being aligned to the long dimension of that particular plane. And then moving on to the case back piece itself, it's still curved like on the original Duneshore, but now it's obviously solid, is bead blasted, and then we have this deep embossing of a sea lion, so to speak. And so that's kind of our mascot for the watch is this creature here, which is like a seal, but our logo is a lion's head door knocker. So we wanted to give it a mane and put a door knocker in its mouth, and so it's kind of our little mascot there. Then you have Duneshore Shallows, and on the other side, Visitor Watch Co. And between the lugs is your serial number. This is all 0 since it's a prototype. And the 4 screws into the case back are polished, and I kind of liked having that little touch of contrast, which reminds you of the little polishing contrast of the indices on the front side. So there's some sort of parallels from front to back. Something else that I think is worth talking about when looking at the Duneshore Shallows mid case is the complexity, I suppose, of this interface relative to your average caseback interface. To preserve the undulating nature of this design, this caseback has to mate flush with the mid case on 4 different surfaces. So, you know, here it mates flush there, and then there, and there, and there. And, you know, that requires extra dimensioning, and, you know, it's just more complex to make, as opposed to like on the Linden, which is a less expensive watch. You have just a single plane where this case back is meeting the mid case. So let's talk about this rubber strap then, which is unique to the Duneshore and designed specifically for this watch. You know, the spirit of the Duneshore Shallows is kind of like casual, cool, aquatic fun. So obviously when thinking about those words, your mind goes to the classic runabout, the Riva Aquarama, or at least mine does. You know, it's in there, right? So if you're not familiar with that boat, certainly I'd recommend Googling it because it's absolutely gorgeous. But that boat inspired the design of this strap. On the top of the strap, you have these twin sets of long grooves separated by a gap, just like the wood detail that runs along the top of the boat. So the sides of this strap begin angled in toward the bottom, near the lugs, or you know, to go with the boat comparison, this would be towards the bow where the hull is angled in, and then that angle then flares out and sort of twists 180 degrees, moving towards the tail of the strap, or the stern if we're using the boat terminology there. So you can see how that twists along and twists out toward the tail, which I think is pretty cool. You know, it's like a subtle little detail twisting the sidewall of the rubber strap, but I think it helps to tie in the you know, fun in the water kind of association. And then the tail of the strap ends the same way as the stern of the Aquarama ends, with this angled semicircular plane. So you got the two sets of grooves of stripes, and the angled side, and then the sort of blunt semicircle angled tail. And the same is true on the upper strap with the twisting sides, except of course the upper strap terminates at the buckle rather than at any sort of tail. This upper line meets the starting edge of the buckle. So that's like one of those little details that you can achieve when you're designing all your own parts from a blank sheet of paper, which is what we are all about doing here. So yeah, the buckle is going to look the same more or less to the original Duneshore buckle, and this buckle again mimics the sand dunes style of the mid case of the watch. The one major difference here is that we have added this recessed area, and then there's Visitor Watch Co on the underside. But this helps with just allowing the straps, particularly this new rubber strap, to lay flat when on your wrist. So that's a nice little change. Oh, and then on the bottom of the rubber straps here, we have these sort of hollowed out and ribbed sections, and that's just to have a little additional airflow on your wrist. Sometimes when you have just one block of rubber sitting on your wrist, it can get a little sweaty more quickly. That section there is to improve the air contact with your wrist. And then there's just Visitor here molded into the upper portion of the strap. 2 NBR keepers. Again, this is an NBR strap, not silicone. I just like that compound a little bit more. Okay, so there you have it. There is a complete detailed breakdown of the Duneshore Shallows. This watch is scheduled to begin shipping here at the end of 2020. So if you think you'd like to pick one of these up, I would definitely recommend heading over to visitorwatchco.com and adding your name to the Duneshore Shallows waitlist. Our wait lists are no commitment style, so you don't have to pay anything to be on them, and they don't lock you into any sort of purchase. All it does is record your interest, and then when a watch is available at your place on the list, you'll receive an email from me, and then you may choose to either purchase or pass. So again, the Duneshore Shallows is coming out here at the end of 2020. Price starts at $750. It's a little more on the bracelet. And there'll be a 2-year international warranty on the watch, which is standard for Visitor Watch Co. And thank you very much again for watching. If you have any comments or questions, please leave those below. Or you can always head to the website and shoot me an email, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much.